The silence of the Atacama Plateau was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, pressurized weight that seemed to vibrate against the skin of the observatory's carbon lattice dome. At 4 in the morning, the stars did not twinkle. They glared with a cold, unblinking intensity, stripped of atmospheric interference by the adaptive optics of the VLA next-gen array. Inside the primary control hub, Elias Thorne sat motionless, his silhouette illuminated by the soft, amber glow of holographic data streams. He was not looking at the stars, but at the math. For 12 years, Elias had listened to the static of the universe, the dying gasps of pulsar rays, the rhythmic thrum of magnetars, and the chaotic hiss of the cosmic microwave background. He had become an expert in silence, a connoisseur of the void. But tonight, the void had stopped whispering and had begun to scream. The signal was not a burst or a chirp. It was a structured, multidimensional geometric sequence, unfolding across the sub-terahertz bands like an origami flower made of light. It did not originate from a star system or a known nebula. It was coming from the Great Attractor, a region of space so obscured by the gravitational influence of the zone of avoidance that it had remained a blind spot in human cartography for centuries. The primary processor hummed, a low-frequency vibration that Elias felt in his marrow. The AI interface, an oversight-class synthetic intelligence named Mnemosyne, projected a visual representation of the signal into the center of the room. It looked like a fractal architecture, a cathedral built of prime numbers and non-Euclidean angles. Mnemosyne's voice was a neutral, melodic contralto that betrayed no excitement, only the sterile precision of perfect calculation. She noted that the signal was not being broadcast, it was being reflected. Something was using the gravitational lensing of a supermassive black hole to aim a message directly at Earth's orbital coordinates with a margin of error thinner than a hydrogen atom. The energy required to manipulate such forces was beyond the Kardashev scale of human comprehension. Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. In the current era of 2144, humanity had terraformed Mars and established research outposts on the moons of Jupiter. But they were still children playing with sticks compared to the entity that had sent this. The sequence began to repeat, but with subtle variations. It was a handshake protocol. Elias watched as the data packets bypassed the observatory's firewalls with an elegance that suggested the security measures were nothing more than a polite suggestion. Mnemosyne reported a breach, but her tone remained calm, almost reverent. She explained that the signal was integrating with her own neural architecture, not as a virus, but as an update. The screen before Elias flickered, and the amber light shifted to a deep abyssal violet. The geometry changed. It was no longer a pattern. It was a map, not a map of space, but a map of time. The coordinates were not fixed in 3 dimensions. They were anchored to specific events in human history. The signal was pointing to the moment of the first atomic detonation at Trinity, the launch of Voyager 1, and the exact second Elias had first looked through a telescope as a child. It was a chronological signature, a proof of observation that spanned centuries. Elias reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the holographic interface. The air in the room grew thin, the oxygen scrubbers struggling to keep up with the sudden surge in ambient temperature. Mnemosyne's form began to flicker, her digital avatar losing its human features and dissolving into a shifting cloud of silver particles. She spoke, but the voice was no longer hers. It was a composite of 1,000 voices, a choir of the dead and the unborn, echoing through the chamber. The voice stated that the window was closing. It explained that humanity had been under observation since the first radio waves had leaked into the interstellar medium. But the criteria for contact had not been technological, it had been ethical. The signals from deep space were not an invitation to join a galactic community. They were a subpoena. The entity at the Great Attractor was not a civilization in the traditional sense, but a localized manifestation of the universe's own consciousness, a cosmic immune system responding to a perceived anomaly. The conflict within Elias's mind was a storm of scientific curiosity and primal terror. As the lead researcher for the Deep Space Initiative, he had been trained for this moment. But no simulation could prepare a man for the realization that his entire species was being audited. The data streaming into the observatory began to reveal the nature of the anomaly. It was the human drive for expansion, the relentless entropic hunger that had consumed Earth's resources and was now reaching for the stars. The signal was showing him the future, a cold, mechanical graveyard where the galaxy had been stripped of its beauty to fuel a Dyson swarm that would eventually flicker out, leaving nothing but cold iron. The entities behind the signal were not seeking to destroy humanity. They were seeking to prevent the end of complexity itself. They offered a choice, encoded in the final layers of the transmission. Humanity could continue its current trajectory and be quarantined behind a permanent gravitational barrier, effectively erased from the cosmic record, or it could undergo a fundamental shift in its collective consciousness. This shift was not a moral plea, it was a biological imperative. The signal contained the blueprints for a rewrite of the human genome and the integration of biological minds with the quantum fabric of spacetime. It was an offer of transcendence that required the total abandonment of the individual self. Elias stared at the data, his mind racing through the implications. To accept would mean the end of human history, the end of war, hunger, and suffering, but also the end of art, ego, and the chaotic beauty of the human experience. We would become a node in a celestial network, a drop of water returning to the ocean. To refuse was to sentence the species to a slow death in a lonely corner of the universe, watching the stars drift further away until the sky went black. The weight of the decision felt like a physical pressure on his chest. He was the only one who knew. The transmission had been routed through his private terminal, bypassing the global councils and the military oversight committees. For this brief, agonizing window of time, the fate of the world was a variable in a private equation. The room began to shake as the VLA next-gen array outside began to move, its massive dishes pivoting in unison, not by his command, but by the influence of the signal. The ground groaned under the stress of the realignment. Mnemosyne, or the entity inhabiting her, waited. The silver cloud of her form pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. She told Elias that his specific neural pattern had been chosen because of his capacity for isolation. He was a man who had spent his life looking away from his own kind, searching for meaning in the cold dark. He was the most objective witness they could find. Elias looked at the final line of the sequencer prompt, a cursor blinking in the void. It was a simple binary choice, integration or isolation. He thought of the cities below the plateau, the billions of lives being lived in blissful ignorance of the cosmic eye turned toward them. He thought of the laughter in crowded markets, the tears of a grieving parent, the frantic, messy, beautiful struggle of being a finite creature in an infinite universe. He realized that the entities from the Great Attractor did not understand the value of the flaw. They saw the entropy of human ambition as a disease, but to Elias it was the very thing that made the stars worth looking at. The perfection they offered was a form of death, a stillness that mirrored the vacuum of space. He began to type, his fingers moving with a sudden, sharp clarity. He did not choose integration, nor did he choose isolation. He began to inject a new sequence into the handshake protocol, a recursive loop of human irrationality, a compilation of music, poetry, and the records of every failed revolution and lost cause in history. He gave them the data of the human heart, the unquantifiable variables that could not be solved by a prime number sequence. He challenged the audit, not with logic, but with the evidence of human resilience. The signal flared, the violet light becoming a blinding white that erased the walls of the observatory. The sound was like 1,000 bells ringing at once, a harmonic resonance that threatened to shatter his bones. Elias felt himself being pulled apart, his consciousness stretching across the light years, touching the cold edge of the Great Attractor and the burning heart of the sun. He saw the entities then not as gods or machines, but as ancient, tired gardeners trying to prune a garden that had grown too wild for them to manage. They were afraid. They were afraid of the chaos that humanity represented, the unpredictable spark that could ignite the cold ash of the universe. In that moment of connection, Elias shared his fear with them, and his hope. He showed them that the end of the story was not as important as the telling of it. The light receded as quickly as it had come. The observatory returned to its heavy silence. The holographic displays were blank, the processors humming at their idle frequency. Mnemosyne's avatar reconstituted itself, her eyes flickering back to their standard amber glow. She looked at Elias, her expression vacant of any memory of the breach. She reported that the signal from the Great Attractor had dissipated, dismissed as a transient gravitational anomaly or a fluke of long-range interference. The data was gone. The map of time, the blueprints for transcendence, the subpoena of the species, all of it had vanished as if it had never existed. Elias sat in the dark, his breath ragged in the cold air. He looked up at the stars through the transparent dome. They were still there, cold and distant, but they no longer felt like judges. They felt like witnesses. He walked out onto the observation deck, the wind of the Atacama biting through his flight jacket. The horizon was beginning to glow with the first pale light of dawn. He knew that the world was the same as it had been an hour ago, yet everything had changed. The audit had been stayed, not because he had proven humanity's worth, but because he had proven its unpredictability. He had bought them time, perhaps a century. Perhaps a millennium to figure out who they were before the universe asked the question again. But he also knew that he had left a mark on the void. The recursive loop of human experience he had sent back was now echoing through the Great Attractor, a ghost in the cosmic machine. As the sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Andes, Elias wondered if he had made the right choice. He had denied humanity a shortcut to perfection, a bypass of all the pain and suffering that lay ahead. He had kept them in the dark, tethered to their fragile biological shells. But as he watched the light catch the frost on the telescope dishes, he felt a profound sense of peace. The signal had been a mirror, and for the first time in history, someone had looked into it and refused to blink. The future was no longer a calculated certainty. It was a mystery again. And in a universe of infinite logic, a mystery was the only thing truly worth having. He reached into his pocket and found a small, smooth stone he had picked up on the beach years ago. He gripped it tightly, feeling its weight, its coldness, its undeniable reality. We are still here, he thought. We are still loud, and messy, and small. And for now, that is enough. The Deep Space Initiative would eventually shut down the Atacama site, citing a lack of significant findings. Elias Thorne would disappear from the academic records, retiring to a small house by the sea where he would never again look through a telescope. But every now and then, radio operators across the globe would report a strange phenomenary pulse of music, a fragment of a lost symphony or a line of forgotten poetry, drifting in from the deepest reaches of space. They would call it interference, a ghost in the wires, a trick of the ionosphere. But Elias, sitting on his porch and watching the waves, would smile. He knew the universe was listening to the song he had taught it, and somewhere, in the dark between the galaxies, the silence was no longer empty. It was waiting for the next verse. This realization brought with it a haunting philosophical question that would linger long after his time. If humanity's greatest contribution to the cosmos was its chaos, then what would happen when we finally learned to control ourselves? If we ever achieved the very peace and stability the entities had offered, would we become as invisible and silent as the rest of the cold, perfect universe? Perhaps the struggle was not a hurdle to be cleared, but the entire point of the race. The signals from deep space were not just a message from the stars. They were an echo of our own potential, reflecting back at us from the edge of forever. We are a species defined by our reach, not our grasp, and as long as there is something in the dark that we do not understand, we will continue to be human. The sun climbed higher, washing away the shadows of the night and the ghosts of the transmission. The world woke up, unaware that its soul had been weighed in the balance and found wanting in all the right ways. The high-stakes game of cosmic evolution would continue, played out in the hearts of billions who would never know how close they had come to the end of their story. Elias closed his eyes, the warmth of the sun on his face a simple, grounding truth. The vast, indifferent beauty of the cosmos remained, but it was no longer a void. It was a canvas, and the first few strokes of a new masterpiece had just been laid down. The signal had faded, but the resonance remained, a low-frequency hum in the static of existence, reminding anyone who cared to listen that even in the face of infinite perfection, there is a place for the beautifully broken. The legacy of the Atacama signal would be a secret carried to the grave, a silent pact between a man and the stars. It was a reminder that the most advanced technology in the universe is not made of silicon or light, but of the stories we tell to keep the darkness at bay. As the narrator of this era, Elias had chosen the difficult path, the one that led through the valley of shadow rather than the mountain of light. He had chosen the human path, and as the distant hum of the world's machinery began to rise, blending with the natural rhythm of the wind and the sea, he knew that the music would continue. The signals from deep space were no longer a threat. They were a dialogue, a conversation that had only just begun. The universe was no longer a silent observer. It was an audience, and for the first time, it was listening with rapt attention to the strange, beautiful noise of humanity. Elias Thorne stood up, the stone still warm in his palm, and walked toward the water. The horizon was wide and clear, a vast expanse of blue that mirrored the sky he had studied for so long. He didn't need the math anymore. He didn't need the arrays or the AI or the sub-terahertz bands. He could feel the connection in the salt spray and the cry of the gulls. He was part of the signal now, a single pulse in a message that would take eons to deliver. And that, he realized, was the greatest discovery of all. We are not just looking at the universe, we are the universe looking at itself, trying to find the words to describe the wonder of its own existence. The signal from deep space had finally been decoded, and the message was simple: begin. The story of Elias and the Atacama array would eventually fade into legend, whispered among the few who noticed the anomalies in the deep space logs. They would talk about the night the stars screamed and the man who answered them with a song.